Inflation is heating up again, and if you're feeling the effects of it, you're not alone. In fact, that just means you're part of the average, because real wages fell from May to June, and honestly, that's not great to see. Marketplace talks about this. In June, America's earnings declined when adjusted for inflation. In addition to inflation data yesterday, there's a new look at how price increases are affecting consumers' purchasing power, their real earnings. Accounting for inflation, hourly earnings fell slightly in June by 0.1%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. 1 month doesn't make a trend, but there are dynamics in both the labor market and inflation data that could further eat into America's wages. And I want to emphasize that this is not a trend. This happened once. It does not mean that the world is falling apart, but that also doesn't mean that it's not something to be aware of. If I'm trying to lose weight and I weigh myself and see that I've gained a couple of pounds, that's no reason to be panicked, but that is a reason to be aware that something might be off, causing the numbers to go in the wrong direction. And this should prompt people and policymakers to get in now and try and fix the problem before it becomes a major issue. Here is the BLS report, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and what they said. Real average hourly earnings for all employees decreased 0.1% from May to June, seasonally adjusted, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported today. This result stems from an increase of 0.2% in hourly earnings combined with an increase of 0.3% in the consumer price index for all urban consumers. So wages went up by 0.2%, but then inflation went up by 0.3%, which canceled that out and also went past the wage growth, meaning that the real wages, were negative 0.1%. But it does get worse. Real average weekly earnings decreased 0.4% over the month due to the change in real average hourly earnings combined with a decrease of 0.3% in the average work week, which means that people worked at 0.3% less. That could have been due to holidays, due to seasonal impacts, or some other reason that people were not working as much as they were before. Now, this is the second time this year that this has happened, as you can see in this chart, and it's also the third time in the last 18 months. And to be fair, this could be another fluke like in April where we saw wages fall slightly but then increase again in May. Or it could be the start of something else since we are starting to see tariff inflation. But before we talk about tariff inflation, I want to make a distinction. We are talking about real wages here. There's a difference between real wages and nominal wages, and this AI overview actually does a pretty good job of explaining it. Nominal wages are the actual dollar amounts earned, while real wages are nominal wages adjusted for inflation, reflecting purchasing power, or how far your dollars can go. Real wages indicate how much can be bought with your income, whereas nominal wages simply show the dollar amount received. The best example that I could think of to help explain this is these two charts. This is nominal wages, so not adjusted for inflation. This is the employed full-time median usual weekly earnings nominal wages since 1979 when the government started tracking these things. And as you can see, with some few exceptions, for the most part, wages have increased in basically a straight line. Every year, wages have been higher than they have been in the previous year, with the exception of maybe 2020 here. But this number does not take into account inflation at all. To do that, we come here and get the median usual weekly real earnings. So this is your income adjusted for inflation, and we get a very different picture. You can see that since 1979, when this was first tracked, they actually went down for a while. Then they went up for a bit, then down, then back up, and then they stayed flat for, this is called the lost decade, where essentially due to inflation and various recessions, wages and earnings and the stock market stayed essentially flat for about 10 years. And then we see a spike during 2020 when it was really hard to get people to work, but then once people started coming back to work because there was no more government stimulus, we see that crash. And as you can imagine, these graphs are very, very different because this one doesn't account for inflation and this one does. But there is a silver lining. Over the last year, on average, wages have outpaced inflation. And you can see that here, also reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Real average hourly earnings up 1.0% from June 2024 to June of 2025. From June 2024 to June 2025, real average hourly earnings increased 1%. The change in real average hourly earnings combined with a 0.3% decrease in the average work week resulted in a 0.7% increase in the real average weekly earnings over the same period. And we can see this real wage increase. This is per year, and you can see that this year, or the last year and a half-ish, it's more or less flatlined where we're sitting between 1 and 1.5% increase in real wages, or wages adjusted for inflation, per year. And to be clear, it is not much, but at least it's something, and we're not seeing the value of your dollars actively crashing like they did here in 2022, where real wages were crashing and burning compared to 9% inflation. If you're enjoying this video and could give it a like, I'm a tiny channel and it really helps out. Now, these numbers of wages increasing in the last year or so may not reflect your individual experience. Very specifically, what we're talking about here is the entire nation at a median average. However, this 1% increase in wage growth outpacing inflation may not be a trend that we see for much longer. We can see here from CNBC, consumer prices rose in June as President Donald Trump's tariffs began to slowly work their way through the U.S. economy. The Consumer Price Index, a broad-based measure of goods and services costs, increased 0.3% on the month, putting the 12-month inflation rate at 2.7%, which is both higher than it was in May, and it's been on an upward trend for the last 2 months. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported on Tuesday. The numbers were right in line with the Dow Jones consensus, although the annual rate is the highest since February and still above the Federal Reserve's 2% target rate. Excluding volatile food and energy prices, core inflation picked up 0.2% in the month and an annual rate of 2.9%, with the annual rate in line with estimates. The monthly level was slightly below the outlook for a 0.3% gain. So we've had 2 months in a row of inflation going up, and we've predicted that the tariff inflation that we expected to see when Donald Trump first came into office would hit sometime during the summer, just kind of generically in Q3, between July and September or whenever. And not only do we have it currently hitting and actually impacting inflation and causing prices to go up, but we have more tariffs coming most likely. So there is a reasonable chance that it will actually get worse and your dollar will start to depreciate more than your wages go up. But to be fair, tariffs are not the only reason that we're seeing inflation increase and your wages come proportionally down. You can see here's the inflation breakdown for June of 2025 in one chart, and we get some of the major categories that CNBC has chosen for us. The price of eggs, and all of these are year over year, so like the price of eggs is up almost 30%, coffee's up 12, almost 13%, uncooked beef, candy, apples, sugar and sweets, sweet rolls, fresh and frozen chicken parts, dried beans. A lot of foods are up pretty significantly, and then food away from home is up almost 4% year over year. And then here we can see that energy is actually down just a little bit. There's some other categories here that weren't included, but specifically like utility gas service is up almost 15%. And then basically all the other foods like subscriptions are up 14%, audio equipment, college textbooks, motor vehicle repairs. Down here we've got like motor vehicle insurance being up 6%, and a lot of these are like day-to-day things that directly impact your life. Now, earlier I said this could be a fluke like we saw in April. Wages dipped briefly, but then came back a month later. But here's why I think it actually could be something. President Donald Trump on Wednesday said that he would be sending letters to over 150 countries as he planned a barrage of duties to take effect on August 1st, including levies on pharmaceutical imports and semiconductors. We're just going to send a notice of payment out, and the notice of payment is going to say what the tariff rate will be, Trump said. It's all going to be the same for everyone for that group. And in addition to this, there were more tariffs announced last week against Canada, plus some follow-up announcements about an additional 30% against the European Union and also Mexico. And if we have tariffs, then import costs increase and the price of goods increase, and that will lead to inflation. You may have seen in some places on the media that that's not how it works, but I can guarantee you that it is. When we get a double whammy of bad news about the economy, like inflation going up and wages coming down proportionally, then it's easy to catastrophize and say that everything's burning to the ground. But I want to be clear that that's not entirely the case. To be clear, things are not amazing right now, but the unemployment data and also the job growth data have both been pretty good, and we can see that reported here by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Unemployment rate changed little at 4.1% for June of 2025, and we can see that the unemployment rate was really high during the pandemic when everything shut down, and it's crept back up a little bit, but for the most part, for the last 6 or 8 months, it's actually been pretty flat and came down 0.1%. That's good because it means that companies are not scared of a recession, but it also means that they're in this awkward holding pattern where they don't really know what to do. The tariffs may happen, the tariffs may not happen, so they don't want to fire people, because if they fire people and the tariffs don't happen, then they have to rehire them all, and that's a bit awkward. But they don't want to hire people either, because if they hire people and then the tariffs do happen, then they have to do a bunch of layoffs. Trump's tariff inconsistency is just causing this kind of weird purgatory where everyone's just kind of waiting to see what happens next. Now, in addition to pretty decent unemployment data, you may have also seen the job growth numbers, which actually came in fairly good. The U.S. added 147,000 jobs in June, relieving some of the concerns of a workforce slowdown. And that's pretty high, but I also want to point out that most of these job growth was actually driven by governments and local and state governments hiring people, not so much private companies. June's increases were led by roles in state and local government education, which added 63,500 positions, with state and local roles overall accounting for half of all job gains for the month. Healthcare and social assistance added another 58,600, while leisure manager in hospitality grew by 20,000 and construction gained just 15,000. So most of these jobs are in places like the government, which doesn't really operate as a business, so it's kind of really hard to count that towards the overall economy doing well. And mainly this just goes to show that a lot of companies are just in a holding pattern. But as for how people feel, they actually don't feel too bad. Consumer sentiment reports from the University of Michigan also largely support this. You can see that the month-over-month change is up about 16%. People in May were not very optimistic about the economy because at the time we still thought that a lot of tariffs were going to come through and they were going to make a lot of people mad and the trade war was going to be a bigger deal than it's actually kind of turning out to be. And so in June, we see that consumer sentiment, or how optimistic people feel about the economy and how the economy is going to do over the next few years, is actually going up. Essentially, people are no longer as worried about the tariffs as they were because it doesn't really seem like they're happening. So they're more optimistic for the future. And honestly, we could use a little more optimism around here. Thanks for watching.